Neoconservatism is a political movement characterized by a belief in American militarism and that the best way to ensure peace is by maintaining America's overwhelming military superiority so as to perpetually secure its position as the world's sole superpower. Neoconservatives also advocate for interventionism in foreign policy, believing that America has the right to act unilaterally to secure peace through strength and promote democracy with or without the approval of the feckless arbiters of international law. The neoconservative movement has been successful at not only reshaping American foreign policy, but in reshaping the Middle East as well. And yet, despite its world historic influence, neoconservatism has few genuine supporters. Even in its heyday during the post 9/11 hysteria, how many Americans called themselves neoconservatives? Certainly not enough to decide an election, as neoconservatism has never been a popular movement, but rather a movement of pundits, intellectuals, and apparatchiks, whose power lay not in their command of voting blocks, but in their control of influential networks, of powerful, well-connected individuals with the experience, publicity, and proximity to power to make their foreign policy ideals a reality. While neoconservatism was never a mass movement, in the climate of terror and uncertainty following 9/11, many Americans, desperate to direct their fears and angers at a tangible target, enthusiastically supported a great neoconservative crusade that sought to liberate Iraq from a terrorist-supporting, weapons of mass destruction hoarding dictator, and in the process transform Iraq and the Middle East as a whole into a bulwark of peaceful, democratic allies of America and Israel. The invasion of Iraq, which was planned and pushed for by neoconservatives, proved to be an abysmal disaster, which quickly lost public support. Although the Iraq War debacle discredited neoconservatism in the eyes of many Americans, neoconservatives have nevertheless remained influential in both Democratic and Republican administrations to this day, which raises the question, where did neoconservatism come from, and how did it become so influential? Today, neoconservatism is forever associated with the foreign policy of the younger George W. Bush, with the disastrous invasion of Iraq, with ill-planned wars waged in the name of spreading democracy. However, the ideals which shaped Bush's foreign policy are a far cry from the ideals of the man widely considered to be the founder of neoconservatism, Irving Kristol. Kristol, the godfather of neoconservatism, never supported efforts to promote democracy through military intervention. In fact, he often spoke out against such efforts. In 1991, when the neoconservative crowd attacked the elder George H.W. Bush for his refusal to overthrow Saddam Hussein during the first Gulf War, Kristol sided with the president, declaring that, quote, "No civilized person in their right mind wants to govern Iraq," unquote. In Kristol's opinion, America's foreign policy interests, quote, "never implied a commitment to bringing the blessings of democracy to the Arab world," end quote. And during the lead-up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the crowning achievement of neoconservatism in action, Kristol did not join his fellow neoconservatives in promoting the war, instead remaining suspiciously silent on the matter. So how is it that the modern incarnation of neoconservatism deviated so far from the ideals of its founder? This video will seek to answer that question, and in doing so, we will examine the strange history and evolution of neoconservatism, a movement which began as a critique of 1960s liberalism by concerned liberals, and moved steadily rightwards over the years, until it reached its ultimate destination as the intellectual force behind the Bush administration's post-9/11 foreign policy. French historian Justin Weiss divides the history of neoconservatism into three distinct eras to help explain the movement's decades-long political evolution. This video will follow a similar format to explain how each era, or rather how each wave of neoconservatism differs from one another. Hopefully, by the end of this video, you will understand the origins of neoconservatism and how it developed from a movement characterized by caution and pragmatism into one characterized by hubris and to some extent nepotism. To understand the origins of the neoconservative movement, we have to understand the people who would become the first neoconservatives. The founding fathers of this movement were mainly New York intellectuals hailing from a predominantly immigrant Jewish background. During the 1930s and 40s, they would witness the failure of appeasement and the deaths of many of their European family members in the Holocaust, instilling in them a militant opposition to any form of compromise with dictatorships. They were bright young strivers, perhaps the type of people who might have made it into Harvard or Yale in another decade, but this was the 1930s, and due to financial constraints and anti-Semitic quotas limiting the number of Jews that could enroll in those elite institutions, these students had no choice but to begin their education at a less prestigious but free institution called the City College of New York. While Harvard was reserved for the children of the Yankee elite, the children of working-class Jewish and Catholic immigrants were left with the CCNY, the poor man's Harvard. The CCNY might not have offered students the best education, but it did give them a hands-on lesson in the intricacies of leftist infighting, for it was impossible to be a student at the CCNY in the 1930s without witnessing and perhaps participating in the ideological battles taking place between the forces of pro-Stalin communists and anti-Stalin leftists in the school's dining hall alcoves. It was in this ideological pressure cooker that the first neoconservatives, Daniel Bell, Nathan Glazer, Seymour Martin Lipset, and of course Irving Kristol experienced their political awakening. Now you might have heard that neoconservatism was founded by the intellectual followers of Leon Trotsky, a figure much revered by the anti-Stalin left. This is a charge often thrown at the feet of neoconservatives by their conservative rivals. But is it true? Were the first neoconservatives Trotskyists? To some extent, yes, but the views that these neoconservatives held in college would not be the views that they would hold for the rest of their careers. As college students, some of these proto-neoconservatives sparred with campus Stalinists, joining the ranks of the anti-Stalin left, a broad coalition which included groups ranging from Trotskyists to anarcho-syndicalists to social democrats. However, of the original neoconservatives, only Lipset and Kristol identified themselves as Trotskyists at the time. Although this college radicalism is a minor footnote in the careers of these individuals, the formative experience of sparring with Stalinists on the battlefield of ideas instilled in these neoconservatives a militant left-wing anti-communism, the kind that could only be found in those with intimate knowledge of Marxism, having debated and engaged with it on a level that mainstream liberal and conservative anti-communists never bothered to do. During the 40s and 50s, these CCNY alumni would moderate their radical views. Kristol claimed that his encounters with other working-class Americans in the military during World War II convinced him that there was, quote, no way to build socialism with people like that, unquote, which led him to abandon his radical views. By the 1960s, Kristol and figures like him fit comfortably into the liberal consensus as anti-communist New Deal Democrats. But while they had moved to the right, the Democratic Party was moving to the left under President Lyndon Johnson, whose ambitious legislative agenda he dubbed the Great Society aimed to end not only racial injustice, but poverty as well. The first wave of neoconservatism emerged in the mid-1960s, primarily as a technocratic critique of these Great Society anti-poverty programs. In 1965, at the height of the Great Society's legislative achievement, and years before the term neoconservative had even been coined, the very first neoconservative organ, a journal called The Public Interest, was founded by two CCNY alumni, Columbia University sociologist Daniel Bell and journalist Irving Kristol. Kristol, Bell, and the other public interest editors didn't identify as conservatives at the time. Instead, they considered themselves to be renegade liberals who were skeptical of overly ambitious government programs. Their journal initially aimed to provide non-ideological technocratic evaluations of Johnson's anti-poverty policies, while maintaining a cautiously optimistic view of the Great Society. However, the public interest became more critical of Johnson's welfare policies over time. Soon its contributors were arguing that these anti-poverty programs would fail because the out-of-touch privileged bureaucrats who were creating them had no understanding of poverty. According to the public interest, all the federal money and federal programs in the world couldn't solve the problem of poverty, which had more to do with education and family than it did with a lack of money. They also argued that the liberal social engineers behind these programs failed to account for the unintended consequence of said programs, which could introduce a whole new set of problems, as in the case with rent control, which kept rent prices down but deterred investors from building more houses, causing a housing shortage. Another issue they saw with these programs is that they overpromised and underdelivered, inflating poverty-stricken Americans' expectations of what the government could do for them, when at best these programs produced meager results in comparison to the great cost they incurred, and at worst, they created new problems that had to be addressed. They eventually began arguing that there were limits to the amount of good that social programs could do, and that the Great Society went too far in its attempts to social engineer away the complex problem of poverty. The public interest also attracted future neoconservative paragon, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who, having left the Kennedy and Johnson administration's Labor Department after publishing a controversial report on the African American family, made some contributions to the journal. Like his colleagues at the Public Interest, Moynihan was becoming increasingly critical of 1960s liberalism, not only because of the Great Society's anti-poverty programs, which he argued were creating a class of parasitic social workers, but also in response to the growing sense of social unrest caused by expanding anti-war protests and urban riots. These factors led Moynihan to argue that the primary concern of liberals like himself should be the stability of the social order, and to pursue that aim, they should make strategic alliances with conservatives who share their concerns and recognize the need for gradual change. Moynihan himself will go on to make such a strategic alliance with Richard Nixon by joining his administration as advisor, viewing him as a conservative who could carry out reforms in the interest of stability. Another driving force behind the rightward drift of this emerging neoconservative movement was the rise of the radical New Left. Emerging out of the student, civil rights, and anti-war movements, the New Left was becoming more radical at a time when neoconservatives were becoming more conservative, putting these two movements on a collision course with each other. The New Left rejected Cold War anti-communism and embraced new issues such as minority rights, feminism, sexual liberation, drug use, and environmentalism. Neoconservatives rejected this movement not just for its new values, which they mocked as the concerns of wealthy, spoiled children, but also for its tactics of using social protests to circumvent the traditional institutional channels for resolving political conflicts, which they viewed as undermining those institutions. The rightward drift of these neoconservatives was accelerated by international events in 1967, when Israel's dramatic victory over its Arab enemies in the Six-Day War awakened in many Jewish neoconservatives a newfound appreciation for the Jewish state, which further inflamed tensions with the New Left, who equated Zionism with racism and imperialism. The neoconservative shift to the right could also be seen on the pages of Commentary magazine, the leading journal for American Jewish life, which in the 1960s had appointed another neoconservative founding father, Norman Podhoretz, as its chief editor. Like Crystal, Podhoretz came from a Jewish immigrant background. His initial tenure as editor was marked by his willingness to publish works by radicals. However, the Six-Day War and the increasing extremism of the New Left led Podhoretz to take a hardline stance against these radicals. In his uniquely provocative style, Podhoretz attacked the New Left for their irresponsible tactics, their anti-Israel views, their fostering of anti-Semitism, and their nihilistic attacks on the American system. What united the many different figures who made up the first wave of neoconservatism was their belief that America was threatened by a moral crisis that was weakening its social stability and its democracy. In the neoconservative mind, the New Left was the source of this crisis, thanks to its challenging of traditional institutions and restriction of free discussion, which eroded the very fabric of American democracy. Neoconservatives also saw the rise of the New Left as intertwined with the expansion of a new powerful class of educated middle managers, academics, and bureaucrats. According to Crystal, this new class was almost anarchistic on most social issues, but on the question of economics, it harbored a hidden authoritarian agenda that sought to implement a highly regulated anti-capitalist regime under the guise of progressive reform. While many of these first-wave neoconservatives were Jewish, and their Jewish identity played a role in their rightward turn, neoconservatism was not a Jewish movement, as some of the most prominent neoconservatives were not Jewish. Moynihan, for instance, was Irish Catholic, and the vast majority of Jewish Americans have never been neoconservatives. This first wave of neoconservatism was, however, a movement of outsiders, made up of successful people from poor immigrant backgrounds, who were not members of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant or WASP elite that made up the American establishment during this era. Unlike the WASP elite, these neoconservatives couldn't take advantage of legacy admissions to Ivy League universities or insider connections, and instead had to get by on their intelligence and hard work alone. By the 1960s, these neoconservatives had achieved success in their respective fields, despite their humble origins, with some even becoming professors at the elite universities that had once discriminated against them. Now they hoped to become the wise men who would advise the next generation of liberal leaders. But when they urged liberal leaders to turn away from the destructive policies of the Great Society, their advice fell on deaf ears. Worse still, they found themselves under assault by the children of the WASP elite, the privileged college students that made up the emerging New Left, who attacked traditional institutional power and the American system that had allowed these neoconservatives to prosper. They had become the kind of traditional liberal intellectuals they had aspired to be, at a time when liberal intellectuals were being ignored by politicians and attacked by radicals. And when they tried to fight back against the excesses of new liberalism and the New Left, they were derided as neoconservatives, a term which, according to Sidney Lipset, was coined by socialist Michael Harrington to discredit these revisionist liberals by portraying them as allies of the conservative movement. This label became synonymous with figures like Crystal, Bell, Podhoretz, Moynihan, and other liberal heretics who attacked the Great Society and the New Left. This is how the neoconservative movement began, but these first-wave neoconservatives, these renegade liberal intellectuals and pundits, who offered insular critiques of the Great Society and the New Left, bear little resemblance to the warmongering neocons of the Bush administration. The neoconservatives of this era were focused on domestic politics, and apart from their strong support for Israel, they were largely uninterested in foreign policy. So what changed? Moving into the next part of this video, we will examine the emergence of the second wave of neoconservatism, a movement which was spearheaded by more conservative elements of the Democratic Party in response to the polarizing rise of the New Left. If the first wave of neoconservatism was composed of intellectuals and pundits like Crystal and Podhoretz, then the second wave was made up of Democratic Party officials, advisors, and even politicians. These second-wave neoconservatives largely hailed from the same background as their first-wave counterparts, having been radicalized by both the Six-Day War and the rise of the New Left. But unlike their predecessors, they were primarily concerned with foreign policy, and on domestic issues, they were mostly Great Society liberals. Figures associated with this second wave of neoconservatism include Jeane Kirkpatrick, Richard Perley, Elliott Abrams, and Paul Wolfowitz, all Democrats who would end up endorsing a Republican by the end of the 1970s. By the early 1970s, the New Left had expanded its influence in the Democratic Party by securing their preferred candidate, George McGovern, as the 1972 presidential nominee, against the wishes of the party establishment. McGovern's perceived support for New Left issues like drug legalization and abortion rights, combined with his dovish foreign policy, which called for an immediate end to the Vietnam War and a reduction in defense spending, resulted in a disastrous landslide loss to Richard Nixon. This defeat had a profound effect on mainstream Democrats, who felt that the New Left had robbed them of an easy victory against the Republicans. Crystal explains the effect that the rise of the New Left had on liberals like himself, claiming that, quote, as the New Left and the counterculture began to reshape liberalism and eventually to reshape the Democratic Party, disenchanted liberals began to find themselves harboring all kinds of conservative instincts and ideas, end quote. Although neoconservatives had failed to curb the rising influence of the New Left, now they were no longer alone in this struggle. After the McGovern disaster, even establishment Democrats like Hubert Humphrey and his supporters were beginning to sound like panicked neoconservatives who worried that the Democratic Party had lost its way. In an attempt to take their party back, these concerned Democrats formed the Coalition for a Democratic Majority, or CDM, a political faction that urged Democrats to abandon the new politics of the New Left and return to tradition by focusing on bread-and-butter domestic issues and taking a hardline anti-communist stance in foreign policy. In addition to first-wave neoconservatives like Crystal, Podhoretz, Bell, Glazer, Lipset, and Moynihan, the CDM could also count on the support of America's largest union, the AFL-CIO, as well as the advisors to top Democratic leaders. Perhaps the most important CDM member was the politician most responsible for shaping neoconservatism into the movement it is today, Henry Scoop Jackson. Scoop Jackson, the junior senator from Washington, often called the senator from Boeing for his hardline support for increased defense spending and his hawkish foreign policy, was the preferred candidate of the CDM. On domestic issues, Jackson was a social democrat who supported universal health care and was backed by unions. However, on foreign policy, he was a staunch supporter of Israel and an uncompromising anti-communist who backed the Vietnam War, opposed arms limitation treaties, and was even critical of the UN. In the early 1970s, Jackson was the Democrats' leading hawk, and therefore the eternal enemy of both the New Left and Henry Kissinger, whose realist foreign policy of détente with the Soviet Union Jackson strongly opposed. When he wasn't fighting for the soul of the Democratic Party, Jackson was working to undermine détente by making universal values like human rights and democracy a point of contention in U.S.-Soviet relations. Next to Irving Kristol, Jackson is the most pivotal figure in the development of neoconservatism, because his Senate office was an incubator for neoconservatives that might be familiar to us today. On Jackson's Senate staff, you could find future Iraq War architect Richard Perley, who had earned the nickname the Prince of Darkness for his hardline opposition to nuclear arms control agreements, as well as Paul Wolfowitz, who would go on to become one of the leading authors of the Iraq War as Bush's Deputy Secretary of Defense. Both men served as aides to Jackson, playing crucial behind-the-scenes roles in undermining détente with the Soviet Union. Other members of Jackson's entourage included future Bush administration fixtures like Elliott Abrams and Douglas Feith, who also worked for Jackson. Despite enjoying the full support of the CDM and the neoconservative movement, Jackson's attempts to secure the 1976 Democratic nomination failed miserably, with Democrats instead nominating a relatively unknown political figure named Jimmy Carter, who would go on to win the presidency. Neoconservatives were cautiously optimistic about the prospect of a Carter presidency, and for good reason. Although Carter was an unknown quantity, he was not the candidate of the New Left, which for neoconservatives and the CDM was a vast improvement compared to McGovern. Neoconservatives like Moynihan and Ben Wandenberg had also had a hand in crafting the Democratic Party's platform, managing to secure a centrist anti-communist foreign policy plank that listed human rights as a top concern. There was even talk of disbanding the CDM when Carter was elected, since there was little reason for it to exist now that the Democratic Party had come to its senses at last. However, Carter's honeymoon with the neoconservative crowd would prove to be short-lived. The neoconservatives of the CDM had no real leverage on the Carter administration, a fact which became obvious early on in his term. The appointment of what the neoconservatives viewed as McGovernites to key foreign policy positions was the first red flag. Specifically, the nomination of Paul Warnke as the head of the agency responsible for carrying out strategic arms limitation talks with the Soviets was particularly offensive, since Warnke's anti-arms race views signaled that the Carter administration would continue the policy of détente. Neoconservatives united in an attempt to defeat the Warnke nomination, and although they failed, the incident revived the CDM and demonstrated that Carter was not the neoconservative president they had all been hoping for. Carter would go on to commit many more neoconservative faux pas. He was insufficiently supportive of Israel. He didn't spend enough on defense. And he didn't take a hard enough line against the Soviets. This angered neoconservatives of all stripes, from politicians like Jackson to the CDM to Commentary magazine, who all critiqued Carter, first as watchdogs who believed they could set him on the right path, and then, when he failed to heed their advice, as outright opponents of his administration. It was in this context that the CDM and its allies began to develop their own coherent neoconservative foreign policy, one that rejected both the cold realism of Nixon and Kissinger and the naive idealism of Carter. The tenets of this neoconservative foreign policy included making human rights a key point of contention in Soviet-American relations, as well as a strong commitment to defending democracies abroad, with a particular focus on Israel. While the goal of making the world safe for democracy had been a standard pillar of the Democratic Party's foreign policy going back to Woodrow Wilson, these second-wave neoconservatives recognized that there had to be practical limits to these lofty goals. Prominent neoconservative and CDM member Jean Kirkpatrick explains this new approach to defending democracy in her famous article for Commentary magazine, Dictatorships and Double Standards. According to Kirkpatrick, the United States should support democracy, but refrain from attacking pro-American right-wing authoritarian regimes by insisting that they should democratize while at the same time relaxing tensions with totalitarian communist regimes, as the Carter administration had done. Kirkpatrick cites Carter's approach in dealing with countries like Iran and Nicaragua, arguing that the pressures placed on these regimes to democratize made them less stable, less democratic, and more anti-American. While she didn't reject the goal of defending democracy, she argues for nuance and that America should weigh its priorities and pick its battles when it comes to supporting democracy. Another tenet of this neoconservative foreign policy was a growing skepticism of the UN, since the body had become increasingly anti-American, with the addition of many former colonies to the UN General Assembly. While second-wave neoconservatives did not uniformly reject international institutions like the UN, they were wary of its ability to keep the peace, instead putting their faith in the military supremacy of America and its allies. Jimmy Carter proved unable to live up to this new neoconservative standard. Even when he eventually did become more hawkish in response to the Iranian Revolution and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, it was too little too late for the neoconservatives, who no longer trusted him and felt his hawkish feint was a desperate attempt to look strong ahead of an election. Viewing Carter as a lost cause, the neoconservatives felt that they had no choice but to search for a new alternative, even if it meant supporting a Republican in 1980. Neoconservatives had already made cross-party connections with the founding of the Committee on the Present Danger, or CPD, a bipartisan, non-ideological group founded by CDM member Eugene Rostow, to raise awareness and at times exaggerate the military threat that the Soviet Union posed to the United States in order to push Carter to abandon détente. While the committee failed to influence Carter, the bipartisan nature of the CPD allowed many Scoop Jackson Democrats to make connections with Republican committee members. One such Republican CPD member was Ronald Reagan. Although they had fully abandoned Carter, it wasn't easy for these neoconservatives, many of whom had been lifelong Democrats, to stomach supporting a Republican for president. Even in early 1980, they still held out hope that Scoop Jackson would launch an inter-party revolt against Carter and secure the nomination for the neoconservatives. However, Carter was challenged not from the party's right wing, but from its left, by Ted Kennedy, who absorbed whatever anti-Carter energy that the neoconservatives were hoping to take advantage of, leaving them with no real options. Seeing potential recruits in these disillusioned Democrats, future Reagan National Security Advisor and CPD member Richard V. Allen worked with Eugene Rostow to make overtures to these neoconservatives in the CPD and convince them to join the Reagan camp. Kirkpatrick and Glazer were some of the first to support Reagan, but sooner or later others joined in supporting him as well, to varying degrees of enthusiasm. Even many CDM members and Democrats close to Scoop Jackson reluctantly supported the Republicans in 1980, finding them to be more in line with their neoconservative foreign policy. This shift to the right benefited many neoconservatives who were appointed to key foreign policy positions under Reagan. Future architects of the Iraq War like Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Perley, and Douglas Feith all served in the Reagan administration, as did Eugene Rostow, Gene Kirkpatrick, and Elliott Abrams, whose loyalty to Reagan got him embroiled in the Iran-Contra affair. Although Reagan staffed his administration with neoconservatives, he wasn't exactly a neoconservative himself. Reagan did many things that neoconservatives supported, like reframing the Cold War as an ideological struggle between freedom and slavery, and presiding over a massive military buildup. But he was also flexible and pragmatic. As president, Reagan took steps to ease tensions with the Soviet Union, and even signed an arms control agreement with them, much to the dismay of his neoconservative allies. That is not to say that neoconservatives had no influence on Reagan's foreign policy. Indeed, the neoconservative who influenced Reagan the most was Gene Kirkpatrick, whose Dictatorships and Double Standards essay caught the attention of the future president and influenced his decision to back anti-communist forces around the world. Reagan's Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberg also had a close relationship with neoconservatives, and some of his administration's most hawkish actions, like the invasion of Grenada, the bombing of Libya, support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and the Contras in Nicaragua, were done at the urging of neoconservative advisors. And that's more or less how neoconservatism went from a movement of disgruntled liberals, critical of the direction that the Democratic Party was moving in, to an influential force within a Republican administration. But that's still not the whole story. These first and second wave neoconservatives merely made a pragmatic alliance with the Republicans to see their preferred foreign policy come to fruition. They were not yet a movement of the right, since many neoconservatives still disagreed with the Republicans on economic and labor issues. This perception of neoconservatives as a reluctant ally of the right does not fit its image during the War on Terror as an essential element of the Bush administration. So what changed between the administrations of Reagan and Bush to make neoconservatism a more thoroughly right-wing movement? We will answer this question in the next section of this video, where we'll examine the third and final wave of neoconservatism. The end of the Cold War brought about an identity crisis within the neoconservative movement. So much of their worldview centered around confronting Soviet communism that even after the Berlin Wall fell, and even as the USSR slowly withered away, some neoconservatives warned that the Soviet Union was more dangerous than ever. After the USSR did fall, some of the founding fathers of neoconservatism questioned the continued need for such a movement in a post-Cold War world. The view that neoconservatism had run its course was held by a small group of neoconservatives led by Irving Kristol, who argued that the conclusion of the Cold War and the dissolution of the USSR meant that America's historic mission of fighting communism and promoting democracy had been accomplished. America could now go back to being an ordinary country that sought only to protect its own interests, and for whom defending democracy was no longer an integral part of its foreign policy. Of the many prominent neoconservatives active at this time, only Nathan Glazer and to a lesser extent Gene Kirkpatrick followed Kristol's path. The overwhelming majority of neocons felt that Kristol sounded too much like Kissinger, whose realist foreign policy they had so vigorously opposed in the 1970s. Thus, first and second wave neocon hardliners like Eugene Rostow, Norman Podhoretz, and Elliott Abrams, to name a few, sought to refocus neoconservatism on combating the growing specter of isolationism in America, arguing that the United States should embark on a renewed democracy-promoting crusade now that it was unencumbered by any serious challenge to its power on the world stage. By this point, Irving Kristol no longer had much in common with the movement he had helped found. In truth, the neoconservative movement had been growing apart from him since the Scoop Jackson Democrats had joined it. But now Kristol, the man who arguably started the neoconservative movement, after being cast aside by liberals, was himself being cast aside by that same movement. Despite his divergence from the emerging modern neoconservatism, Kristol remains a pivotal figure in the evolution of neoconservatism even after the movement's founding, because he played a pivotal role in the development of the networks that helped to tie the movement together and turn it into a genuine counter-establishment. In helping to found the first neoconservative journal, The Public Interest, Kristol not only gave voice to neoconservative views, but also forged important ties with the business community by turning the journal into a mouthpiece for supply-side neoliberal economics. Kristol strengthened ties between neoconservatives and Wall Street by becoming a routine contributor to the Wall Street Journal. In his writings, he made the case to the captains of industry that American capitalism was under attack by the forces of the New Left, and that the people best equipped to defend capitalism were neoconservative intellectuals like himself. Kristol also helped to transform a think tank called the American Enterprise Institute into a neoconservative intellectual arsenal that would only grow in prominence, reaching its peak during the administration of George W. Bush, which came to rely on the Institute's research and personnel. Other nodes in this neoconservative network included think tanks such as Freedom House, National Endowment for Democracy, Committee for the Free World, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, as well as journals like Podhoritz's Commentary magazine, The National Interest, and The New Republic. As Scoop Jackson's Senate office was a nursery for second-wave neoconservatives, this vast network of think tanks, journals, and personal relationships was the fertile soil from which the third wave of neocons would spring forth, breathing new life into a listless movement. First-wave neocons like Kristol and Podhoretz merely created neoconservatism, but the neocons of the third and final wave were born into the movement, molded by it. And I mean that literally. One of the most prominent third-wave neocons is Bill Kristol, the son of first-wave neocon Irving Kristol, and I swear I'm not making this name up, Gertrude Himmelfarb. Another prominent neocon of this era is John Podhoretz, son of first-wave neocon Norman Podhoretz and Midge Decter, who also happened to be the brother-in-law of yet another neocon, Elliot Abrams. These nepotism cases, or nepocons, might have shared the same blood as their neocon forebearers, but they lacked the same radical background. Far from being a college Trotskyist like his father, Bill Kristol's youthful radicalism never went beyond campaigning for Hubert Humphrey. As an adult, however, he was thoroughly conservative, eventually serving as chief of staff for the elder Bush's idiotic vice president, Dan Quayle. Likewise, John Podhoretz was also a lifelong conservative, serving as a speechwriter for Reagan and the elder Bush. In 1995, not long after the founders of neoconservatism were proclaiming the death of the movement, Bill Kristol and Fred Barnes founded a magazine called The Weekly Standard with money from Rupert Murdoch. The Standard gave voice to a new generation of neocons like John Podhoretz, David Brooks, Robert Kagan, and Charles Krauthammer, who were disillusioned conservatives troubled by the rise of isolationism and anti-government sentiment in the Republican Party. As opposed to the mainstream Newt Gingrich style of conservatism, which sought to shrink government and dismantle the welfare state, the Weekly Standard championed a national greatness conservatism, which sought to reform government to make it more efficient and less wasteful. The main focus of this national greatness conservatism that Bill Kristol and company were trying to sell was its foreign policy. According to them, the greatest threat that America faced now that the Cold War was over was its own apathy. If the U.S. were to let its guard down and turn its back on its global peacekeeping responsibilities, then a new evil empire might rise up to fill the vacuum left by America. Thus, America's goal on the world stage must be to maintain its global hegemony. A few years after the Weekly Standard's foundation, its creator Crystal and contributor Robert Kagan, who is also the son of a prominent neoconservative historian, lamented the fact that their calls for a return to a Reaganite foreign policy of military superiority and moral absolutism had gained little traction among 1990s Republicans and the American people as a whole. Speaking with some old guard neocons, Norman Podhoretz and Midge Decter, they were reminded of the role that groups like the Coalition for a Democratic Majority and the Committee on the Present Danger had played in promoting neoconservative foreign policy ideas. Inspired by the example of these groups, Crystal and Kagan founded the Project for the New American Century, a think tank / committee that aimed to promote a neo-Reaganite foreign policy. Like the CDM before it, which sought to counter isolationism in the Democratic Party and promote Scoop Jackson as their ideal candidate, the Project for the New American Century aimed to do the same thing for the Republican Party and put forth as their preferred candidate the hawkish Arizona Senator and former POW John McCain. The American Enterprise Institute, Weekly Standard, and the Project for the New American Century, all of which operated out of the same building, represented the beating heart of this third wave of neoconservatism that breathed new life into a moribund movement. Third wave neoconservatism was bolder than any previous incarnation, seeking to perpetually maintain America's military superiority and its global hegemony. They also believe that democratic countries are inherently friendlier to the U.S. and more peaceful to their neighbors, meaning that by taking an active role in the spread of democracy, the U.S. would be strengthening its own security and ensuring peace for the rest of the world. If one were to point out to these neocons that this American hegemony seemed to resemble an American empire, they would probably reply by saying, "So what? Sure, America might be arrogant and prone to making mistakes, but is it not more benevolent than any empire that came before it, or any that seeks to replace it? If the American empire is one of peace, democracy, and security, then is it not a benevolent empire? Is not the expansion of such an empire an objectively good thing?" Another familiar tenet of third wave neoconservatism is their skepticism of international institutions like the UN. However, unlike their predecessors, third wave neocons viewed the UN as not just inept, but illegitimate. Neocons felt that instead of maintaining peace, the UN empowers oligarchies and dictatorships in the Security Council by giving them veto power. For these neocons, even international law and arms limitation treaties are viewed with suspicion since they restrict American power while allowing international bad actors to cheat. For neocons, the only sure guarantee of peace comes not from international institutions, laws, or treaties, but from force of arms. As such, America's military must be immensely superior to all of its rivals. This skepticism of international institutions and international law is what separates neoconservatives from their liberal interventionist counterparts. Although liberal interventionists like Hillary Clinton or Tony Blair might share the same goal of promoting democracy through military intervention, they tend to place more value on international law, and they certainly don't believe that international institutions like the UN are inherently illegitimate, as the neocons do. That said, despite their differences, liberal interventionists and neocons have been known to make common cause with each other, as they did during the invasion of Iraq. This reinvigorated third wave of neoconservatism emerged with the support of second wave neocon hardliners, now experienced defense and State Department bureaucrats who were determined to take neoconservatism into the 21st century. Working under the George W. Bush administration and Defense Secretary Dick Cheney, old guard neocons Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Perley, and Scooter Libby drafted the Defense Guidance Plan, a defense strategy that laid out a blueprint for how to maintain America's military hegemony in the post-Cold War world of the 1990s. Although the elder President Bush had to distance himself from the plan when it was leaked and caused a firestorm of controversy, many of the plan's tenets would later reemerge under his son's foreign policy doctrine. These old guard neocons would readily embrace the next generation of neoconservatism, with many of them including figures like Wolfowitz, Perley, Elliott Abrams, John Bolton, and their ally Donald Rumsfeld becoming core members of the Project for the New American Century. A particular target of these third wave neocons was Saddam Hussein's Iraq, whose recent invasion of Kuwait had spurred America into action. While the resulting American intervention had successfully foiled Saddam's attempts to conquer Kuwait, neocons viewed the Gulf War as a failure because the U.S. had stopped short of deposing the Iraqi dictator. Saddam's unwillingness to cooperate with the UN's weapons inspectors was the final straw for the neocons, who, through the Project for the New American Century, successfully lobbied Congress to pass the Iraq Liberation Act in 1998, which made regime change in Iraq official U.S. policy. Despite this impressive victory, the neocons seemed to be losing their hold on the Republican Party, with the defeat of their favorite candidate, John McCain, who lost to George W. Bush in the 2000 Republican primary. The younger Bush's election as president was at first met with skepticism by the neoconservative crowd. Although he had tapped Wolfowitz to advise him, on foreign policy, Bush was more closely aligned with realists like Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell. And on the campaign trail, he committed many neoconservative faux pas, like criticizing the Clinton administration for being too interventionist and dismissing the idea that America should engage in nation building. Bush indicated that as president he would exercise restraint in the realm of foreign policy, only intervening if American interests were at stake. However, the former Texas governor also had little in the way of foreign policy experience, and two of his key cabinet positions, Secretary of Defense and the Vice Presidency, were held by neocon allies Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney. Rumsfeld, who had been a part of the neoconservative network through his membership in groups like the Committee on the Present Danger, Freedom House, and the Project for the New American Century, installed neocons Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith as his second and third in command at the Pentagon. Vice President Cheney, who had overseen the development of the neoconservative Defense Guidance Plan, was also embedded in the neocon think tank network through his membership in the American Enterprise Institute, and would appoint neocon Scooter Libby as his chief of staff. Elliott Abrams also served as a senior director of Bush's National Security Council. Although the younger Bush initially pitched himself as a foreign policy realist who believed it was not America's job to export democracy, many of the people advising him and in charge of key positions in his administration were neocons themselves or allies of the movement. The neoconservative influence on the Bush administration wasn't apparent from day one. Indeed, early on into his term, the Weekly Standard attacked Bush for his small defense budget and his weak stance against rogue nations like Iraq. Bush's neoconservative side, which had only been hinted at before, began to assert itself in full after the deadly 9/11 terrorist attacks. When a terrorized nation demanded an aggressive foreign policy that aimed to ruthlessly punish the perpetrators of these attacks, Bush and his advisors answered by putting forth an aggressive foreign policy that stressed bold unilateral action, American military superiority, black and white morality, and the expansion of democracy by force if necessary. Bush responded to these attacks by listening more to his neocon advisors, and by effectively becoming a neoconservative himself. The War on Terror and the invasion of Afghanistan to dislodge the Taliban and Al-Qaeda followed, but this campaign alone wasn't enough for neocons, because as Defense Secretary Rumsfeld so eloquently put it, quote, "There aren't any good targets in Afghanistan, and there are a lot of good targets in Iraq," end quote. 9/11 and the newfound popularity that Bush now enjoyed gave him the political capital to remake American foreign policy prerogatives along neoconservative lines. This became apparent with the Bush Doctrine, which was based on neoconservative ideals, from its declaration that democratic nations are peaceful nations that do not harbor terrorists, and therefore The unilateral use of American power to promote democracy in the Middle East would not only bring about peace in the region, but it would also end the threat of terrorism and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Neoconservative influence can be seen in the Bush Doctrine's tendency to frame the world in terms of black and white, as evidenced by Bush's inability to differentiate between the terrorists and the rogue states believed to be aiding and abetting them, an inclination that led the Bush administration to view Iraq as a major enemy in the war on terror. You probably know the rest. The Bush administration built up the case for a preemptive invasion of Iraq based on spurious claims that Saddam had connections to the 9/11 attacks, al-Qaeda, and was harboring weapons of mass destruction that he might share with these terrorists. The neocons and their allies in the Defense Department played a key role in the selling and planning of the invasion, while the neocon network of think tanks and journals did their best to generate support for this invasion in the hysterical post-9/11 climate. In the eyes of the neocons, the Iraq War and the democratic transformation it would usher in would serve as a successful example of neoconservative foreign policy in action that would be repeated against other dictatorships in the region. And initially, it seemed like this would be the case. The 2003 invasion brought a swift end to Saddam's regime, and for a euphoric moment, neoconservatism had won. They had taken unilateral and preemptive action against the will of everyone from the liberal sissies at home to the UN naysayers abroad. They had liberated millions of people from a dictator, bringing freedom and democracy to a region thought to be incompatible with such concepts. They were at the height of their power and influence, bolstered by their successes abroad, and for the neocons, Iraq was only the beginning. Iran, Syria, and Libya were all next on the regime change menu, and why shouldn't they be? With how easily Iraq fell, how could anything halt the neoconservative crusade? But of course, that brief victory in Iraq was quickly consumed by protracted insurgency and civil war. America proved unable to give Iraq peace and stability, let alone freedom and democracy, a situation made worse by the fact that no weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq. This turn of events, combined with Bush's declining popularity, mounting casualties, and revelations about the torture of Iraqi prisoners by Americans in Abu Ghraib prison, marked the beginning of the end of the neoconservative golden age. Despite the intense scrutiny they faced, many neocons inside and out of the Bush administration doubled down, touting the Iraq War as a success that had liberated Iraqis. A few, however, did waver, like neoconservative writer David Brooks, who confessed that he had been wrong about the war. Another prominent neocon leader, Richard Perley, the Prince of Darkness himself, attempted to distance himself from the Iraq War debacle he had helped to create by placing the blame on a favorite neoconservative scapegoat, Donald Rumsfeld, for his poorly executed invasion and occupation. Even more bizarrely, Perley later declared that there was, quote, no such thing as a neoconservative foreign policy, end quote, and also that neocon influence on the Bush administration had been greatly exaggerated. Ironically, during this period of neoconservative decline, a neocon favorite, John McCain, managed to secure the Republican nomination for the 2008 election. But McCain was handily defeated by a figure much reviled by neocons at the time for his opposition to the Iraq War, Barack Obama. Neoconservative influence in the Republican Party was seemingly crushed when the anti-Iraq War America First candidate Donald Trump won the 2016 nomination and subsequent election, which appeared to mark the end of the neoconservative movement. Not exactly. Although most neoconservative pundits would become politically homeless never-Trump Republicans, who would reluctantly back Democrats like Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, neoconservative officials and experts did all right for themselves in this era. Despite being reviled by neocons for his Iran nuclear deal, among other things, Obama appointed as his Assistant Secretary of State prominent neocon Victoria Nuland, who also happened to be the wife of Project for the New American Century co-founder Robert Kagan. Nuland would go on to reprise her role in the Biden administration. Despite being perceived as the anti-neocon candidate in the Republican Party, Trump appointed quite a few neocons himself, including Mike Pompeo, who served as his CIA director and Secretary of State, as well as some familiar faces like John Bolton, who served as Trump's national security advisor, and of course, Iran-Contra co-conspirator Elliot Abrams, who served as Trump's special representative for Venezuela and Iran. So despite the decline of neoconservatism as a whole, the fact that some of its greatest proponents have kept their power and influence in government demonstrates that neoconservatism isn't going away anytime soon. There you have it, the history of neoconservatism, from its beginnings as a group of former leftists who criticized 1960s liberalism and the New Left from a moderate perspective, to its slow growth into a pressure group pushing for a return to a more traditional Democratic Party politics. We witnessed neoconservatives migrate from the Democratic Party into the Reagan camp, where they played an influential role in Reagan's foreign policy. We saw how the end of the Cold War sparked an identity crisis within the movement, and how neoconservatism was rejuvenated with the rise of the Neocons. Lastly, we saw neoconservatism reach its highest highs and lowest lows during the Bush administration, culminating in the Iraq War. The most fascinating detail about this neoconservative odyssey is how neoconservatism evolved into the exact thing the movement was created to oppose. The first neoconservatives were strivers, typically from immigrant backgrounds, who had to earn their place through their own merit, unlike the WASP elite. The first neoconservatives critiqued the anti-poverty programs of the Johnson administration because the privileged bureaucrats devising these programs didn't understand poverty as the first wave neoconservatives who had grown up poor did. These neoconservatives argued that all the federal money and federal programs in the world couldn't solve the problem of poverty, which had more to do with education and family than it did with the lack of money. They also argued that the liberal social engineers behind these anti-poverty programs failed to account for the unintended consequences of said programs, which could introduce a whole new set of problems, as in the case of rent control potentially causing a housing shortage. Another issue they saw with these initiatives is their tendency to overpromise and underdeliver, inflating poverty-stricken Americans' expectations of what the government could do for them, when at best they produced meager results in comparison to the great costs they incurred, and at worst, they produced a new set of problems that had to be addressed. These were some of the first arguments ever articulated by neoconservatives, and isn't it ironic that these critiques could easily be applied to the neoconservatives of the 21st century? Think about it. The neocons of the Bush era weren't scrappy anti-establishment outsiders. They were elite members of a new counter-establishment, created by their neocon forebears. Many of them were the children of those original neoconservatives, and they were not the nuanced, cautious intellectuals that their parents were. They were idealistic, partisan conservatives, whose faith in the neocon doctrine that American power can and should be used to reshape the Middle East into a region of peaceful democratic nations was untempered by fears of the unintended consequences of such actions. These privileged neocon pundits and officials were not experts on the Middle Eastern countries that they sought to fundamentally reshape. They understood the Middle East even less than the liberal bureaucrats of the 1960s understood the poor. Nevertheless, they insisted that the imposition of democracy on countries like Iraq, that were never democratic to begin with, would bring peace and security to the region, inflating the expectations of both Americans at home and Iraqis abroad. Although the American invasion of Iraq brought down a dictatorship, the subsequent occupation came at a great cost of blood and treasure, and it brought forth not the peaceful, stable democracy that was promised, but a corrupt, fledgling democracy, plagued by instability, sectarian violence, and civil war, all unintended consequences of the invasion. In other words, neoconservatism, a movement that was originally founded to critique out-of-touch establishment bureaucrats, politicians, and pundits, became just that, a movement of privileged elites trying to reshape a world they barely understood. In 2009, the founding father of neoconservatism, Irving Kristol, died at the age of 89. He lived to see neoconservatism reach the height of its power and influence in the Bush administration, and even long enough to see its bitter decline, though by that point neoconservatism was virtually unrecognizable from the movement he had helped found. Through it all, Crystal maintained his more realistic foreign policy view, which set him apart from third-wave neocons. In the 1990s, during the first Gulf War, he broke with the other neocons by opposing regime change in Iraq. However, during the final decade of his life, when neoconservatives were running American foreign policy, he was noticeably silent on the foreign policy issues of the day, and had virtually nothing to say about the invasion of Iraq, or the current state of neoconservatism. To the extent he did talk about neoconservatism in his last few articles, 40 Good Years and My Public Interest, both published in the mid-2000s, Crystal avoided discussing the movement as it existed at the time, and instead reflected on the origins of the neoconservative persuasion, in those early days when it was just focused on critiquing liberals and their attempts to solve poverty without truly understanding it. One has to wonder if, as Crystal looked back on the origins of neoconservatism, he saw how the critiques he had once leveled at 1960s liberals could now easily be applied to the neoconservatives of the time. Did he on any level recognize that the neoconservative project he began all those years ago, the movement his son now arguably led, had degenerated so far from its origins that it had essentially become the very thing it once sought to destroy? I guess we'll never know.